It's that spooky time of the year again, where we all celebrate both Halloween, October, and of course, Terraintober, all of which are obviously very real and very important things. And so I decided it was time for a long overdue return to everyone's favorite spoopy-filled northern wasteland. So, welcome back to the Angmar project. It's actually been exactly 1 year since we were here last, and one of the reasons for that is we kind of already have everything we need. Yes, I want more trolls, and I do have to have a gully one day. It'd also be really nice to have a shade and tons of other stuff, but the army I have now actually works really well. So to get back into it, rather than making more spooky little critters, let's instead make somewhere for them all to live. But to do that, we need to hit the books and talk about all the important lore of Angmar in order to determine just what kind of terrain to make. And right out of the gate, we kind of have an issue. Over the past couple of weeks, I have been reading through as much direct info on Angmar and its land as I possibly can find in the books, and the more I look, the more I found that, yeah, there's really not that much. This is something I brought up before, as one of the things that I like so much about making my Angmar and Arnor armies is that there's actually not all that much detail about them in the books. Yes, we do have a pretty extensive overview of the conflicts and countless interpretations and adaptations over the time, but the books leave a lot of room for creativity. So after going through all of this, I decided to focus on two distinct details. The first being that Angmar wasn't just here, but ranged all the way across the mountains as far as Gundabad. The movies even reinforce this relationship between Gundabad and Angmar, and so it's a good reference for how to approach this. While Tolkien never specified who built Carn Dûn, he does state that Gundabad was originally a dwarf hold that was overtaken by orcs, but really don't see much of that in the movie design, which is a wild, spiky, metal-bladed fortress. Which brings us to the other details, the name itself. Carn Dûn doesn't have any direct translation or meaning we know of, but Angmar does, as it means Iron Home in Sindarin. The other thing of note was the name is how close it is to Angband, the Iron Prison, the fortress of Melkor in the northern wastes of Middle-earth. So going by those, I really like the idea that maybe Angmar was originally an offshoot of Melkor's northern kingdom, and that maybe much of it was actually built way back then, which means we're going for a distinctly evil look, purpose-built, rather than something that had been reclaimed from another kingdom. Next, that word iron really hits me, so I decided I was going to lift the metal-plated look from the Gundabad of the movies to fit in both with the name itself and reinforce the relationship between those two kingdoms. Additionally, if we also stick with the rusty orange tones of Gundabad, we're also going to have a really nice contrast between that and the bluey permafrost-style bases of the rest of my Angmar army. And with that, a plan started to take shape, so I jumped right in. And while there was no way I could build a full Carn Dûn right now, I decided I wanted to build a watchtower as a way of determining the style of the land. So to start off, I did something that I don't usually do, in that I started with a template. I decided I wanted to lean into triangular shapes for the tower, as triangles are pretty sharp and aggressive looking and would make a nice change from the more classical round or square shapes of most fantasy buildings. And to ensure that all the sides fit together nicely, I cut out a piece of paper to the shape I wanted before tracing this out on some cardboard. I then traced 2 more copies of this end to end to create one long shape. This means I can cut the whole thing out before cutting halfway through the joined long edges, which let me then bend the whole thing into one 3-dimensional shape which I could use for the base of the tower. I've gotten a lot of boxes lately, so I decided to focus this build around cardboard, which is not a material I usually use, but it worked out really nicely in this case. I then cut out some jagged spikes from some thinner cardboard before attaching them to the top of the tower and reinforcing them with some cocktail sticks. I then added some low walls between this to create an open spot on top that models could be placed on. Using some coffee stirrers and more cocktail sticks, I then created a door on the bottom before moving on to some more details. Firstly, I added an angled structure jutting out from over the door to make it stand out a bit more, as well as several little windows around the tower, which I made by creating a little diamond shape out of the cardboard and sticking them onto the main body. This thin cardboard was pretty weak and had a pretty boring texture, so to solve both of those, I decided to take some of this drywall compound, which I proceeded to smear all over the upper spikes, as well as the windows and the door details we had just done. I applied this pretty roughly as I wanted to start getting that kind of nasty, rough metal texture we were looking for. Once dry, this was still a little bit brittle, so I finished it by adding multiple coats of Mod Podge until it was nice and solid. As I said, I wanted this whole thing to look like it's coated in metal, but I didn't just want to use more of this spackle over the whole thing. So I turned to this cardboard packing material that came with some recent stuff we ordered, as well as a few egg cartons. Both of these have a really nice texture to them, and by using them both, we could get some nice variety. So I started off by just cutting out rough shapes from these before fitting them together on the tower. I was sure to fit them together fairly nicely with nice sharp angles and to try and use a good mix of both the packaging cardboard and the egg carton to keep an uneven feeling. This was definitely the longest part of the process as it involved a lot of cutting and fiddling to get the shapes and look I wanted. But after a while, I was really happy with the final look. I did still have some pretty big gaps here and there, but I wasn't too worried about that as I had a plan. Going back to construction material, I grabbed some cheap silicone caulking, which I then used as, well, caulking. I ran this around the individual pieces before blending it in with my finger to make the whole thing look and feel more cohesive, like it had all been roughly welded together before the build. Once this was all done and dry, I then took a knife and cut off any overhanging bits to get a nice clean edge, and we were done with the tower itself, but it still needed a base. I had one big round base left over from the Mirkwood Forest video, so I grabbed that to use. But I still wanted the whole thing to have a bit of height, so I once again grabbed some more cardboard and built up a bit of a hill for the tower to stand on. Now that we had that, we needed to sort out the ground cover, and I tried something different here. I again grabbed the drywall compound from before, which I mixed in with a bunch of torn up paper to make a kind of poor man's modeling compound. I then added some decorative sand and paint to it before slathering it onto the base. My hope was that since this was a non-shrink compound with the paper and cardboard adding some flexibility, this wouldn't warp the base too much. And I was almost right, but even if the final piece is a bit warped, it's way better than usual, so I'm pretty happy with how this worked. Once that was mostly dry, I added some extra details, starting with bricks leading up to the door using some Mod Podge and egg carton, which I then blended in by pouring some sand over top. For a few bigger details, I used a bit of construction adhesive to stick down some rocks I found outside, as well as a couple of bits from the old Citadel Woods kit that I had lying around, before once again blending them in with some sand. Finally, for the last touches, I used super glue to stick down some clumps of static grass scattered around the piece, just like what I used on the rest of my Angmar army. And so now we move on to painting, and what is that? Well, there you are. This month, my wife and I actually had a baby, so that's why this video has taken a bit longer to come out and why I may have been a bit quieter here and on my socials. It's been amazing, but also a lot. And while I thank you all for sticking with me, the biggest thank you goes out to my patrons who have stuck with me through all of this. In particular, I want to welcome my newest supporters, Zachary and Harrison. And if any of you want to join up or just show your support, you can always hop on over and check out the page where I post semi-regular blog updates and even have a private Facebook page set up for it. Or if you were looking for something a little less consistent, I actually also have a Buy Me a Coffee page set up. So if you wanted to shoot a little something over there, it would mean a lot, and I'll be sure to give you a shout out in the next video. Speaking of which, another big milestone happened this month, in that we hit 7K subscribers, which is awesome. So for the next video, I'm planning a little celebration, where we paint up a random model, maybe do a giveaway, and potentially even some question and answers. And if you do have any questions you'd like me to answer in it, put them in the comments below and I'll be sure to get to them. But in the meantime, let's get back to the projecting, which I started by giving a Xanthal Prime in the same way I do for all of my Angmar related models. I plan to paint this tower in the same rusty way as I did for the armor on my Mirkwood Orcs, and so started off by mixing some craft paints together to get as close an approximation of Mournfang Brown as possible. Next, I painted some of the details in, like the rocks and trees, using an off-white, and then mixed up a really dark silver for the top spikes, as well as the borders around the windows and door. Finally, I mixed up an approximation of Macragge Blue with craft paints and painted that all over the ground before moving on to the washes. I used a leopard spotting approach to both the rocks and stone bits, applying a wide range of washes and blotches all over those areas to give some nice natural variation. I actually painted the trees and stones in the same way basically, as I was going for a kind of petrified wood look, as if the trees were long dead by this point and already fossilized. As for the rest of the build, I once again used the same approach as I did for my Angmar models and for that cursed city building from ages ago, by applying a brown wash to the top half and a mix of blue to the bottom. So to make some quick washes, I grabbed some plastic shot glasses, a few inks, and some water and got to mixing. The most important thing to remember when doing this is to do it all by eye so that you can't recommend any particular mixes, and also to not clear out the tips of the bottle as well as you should have, so that when you end up squeezing too hard, the whole top pops off and dumps way too much into your mix, causing you to have way more wash than you needed and wasting a ton of your fancy scale 75 inks.
Fuck.
Once I had those done though, I started slapping them pretty heavily onto the piece, going side by side and mixing the blue and brown washes together about halfway down as I said I would. Once it was fully covered and dried, I was pretty happy with the finished look, so we started to hit it with some dry brushing. Like I said, the bases were painted just like the bases of my normal Angmar minis, with an initial dry brush of Xandri dust. While I wouldn't normally use fancy mini paints on a terrain piece like this, I had a half-dead pot of Xandri dust just lying around, so I decided to just go for it. I even applied this to the trees and rocks to get a bit more color variation before applying a vanilla dry brush over the whole base. To make the piece more cohesive, I actually applied this to the bottom third of the tower as well, before getting into the rest of the tower paint proper. As I said, I wanted to get this nice and rusty like Gundabad from the movies, and so went with the same rusty paint technique I did for my Mirkwood Orcs. So to start, I mixed up some craft paints to as close an approximation of Deathclaw Brown as I could before ripping up some sponges and using those to apply this to the piece. I went really heavy with this over the whole thing, but was sure to still leave a majority of the existing colors, as this was only the first of a couple of rounds of splotching, and I didn't want to cover it up completely. Next, in fact, I mixed up a nice dark brown and applied it to the tower in the same way. This time it went a bit lighter, but still added a decent amount of splotching. Next, we needed to push the contrast, so we went with some pure black. This needed to be a lot more selective, so I decided to use an older brush that was starting to fray and just stippled this onto the piece where I thought it would stand out nicely. I particularly focused on the edges and points of pieces, as this is where we were eventually be applying our metallics. Speaking of which, once all the black was on, I went back to my model paints for the metals, as I wanted them pretty strong. Basically, I took a far too fine brush and just added little nicks and dots around the whole thing with a bright silver. The idea being that this is where the rust had cracked and rubbed off through debris and rough weather. These tended to focus on sections I had already made black, as well as it helped the silver to really pop. To finish this up, I actually got a big dry brush out too and used the same silver on the spikes, windows, and door frame. Then for one final touch, I got some pure orange and dotted that around the piece as well. I actually think I might have gone a little bit heavy here, as it does look a bit much, but it does really make the whole thing pop, so I'm pretty happy in the end. So to finish out the piece, I added a few extra little details to the base, including some black washes over the stones and a brown one over the trees and patches of grass. And with the painting out of the way, I got out the same tufts I used on my mini bases, as well as a couple of extra before applying them randomly around the base. I feel like I often don't add enough greenery to my pieces, and so tried to go a bit heavier here, while not going so far as to lose that desolate look I was going for. And there you are, my first terrain piece for the Kingdom of Angmar. I think it turned out really cool. I feel like it is a pretty distinct and unique look that fits into the setting and matches well with the rest of my army, but what do you think? Regardless though, thank you for sticking around, as I'm excited for where else I could go with this. Inevitably, I want to build some kind of board for Angmar, as well as a few more pieces like this, as well as some maybe more natural bits, and eventually Carndoon itself. So be sure to subscribe and ring that little notification thingy so you don't miss out, and share and like the video as always. But for now, just stay safe out there, and I'll see you next time.